20 years ago, Linda Shum's life changed when she read an article about the plight of unwanted babies in China. A year later, she visited an orphanage in a small Chinese city and she's supported that orphanage ever since. Linda's extraordinary story is told in a new book, China Baby Love, by the ABC's Jane Hutcheon. And Jane joins us now. Jane, welcome to News Breakfast.
Hey, Virginia. Good morning.
It's nice to see you in 3D.
Absolutely.
We're normally thrown to your terrific interviews, of course, on 1+1. But before that, you were in China for quite a long time, weren't you?
That's right. I was the correspondent there for 5 years. Born and grew up in Hong Kong, so China was this sort of big nation to our north.
Yep.
So in a way, you know, China's a very familiar place for me. It's easy for me to go and practice my terrible Chinese on people to ask them questions about their daily life. But I love it. I love China.
It is an extraordinary country, and I guess, you know, the more you dig into it, the more complex it becomes. This is one of the most troubling aspects of China. It's one-child policy, the abandonment of children. How did Linda Shum's story come to your attention?
Well, you know, as it is, it was just before Julia Gillard's trip to China in 2013, and I was looking around for someone who wasn't a specialist on China. I wanted a person-to-person kind of story.
Yep.
And all of a sudden, it was bizarre. This email drops into my inbox, but it's half finished. And it was from this woman who said she ran foster homes within an orphanage. And I sort of Googled her, and I saw that it was legit. So in the end, I invited her on the show, and I did a 7-minute interview with her on The World one evening just before Julia Gillard left China.
And you learnt about her extraordinary story where she has just devoted her life, really, to so many abandoned children. Tell us about the children. Who are they? How do they come to this place?
Well, this is the really sad thing. So there are probably around 600 orphanages around China. This is one in a very small Chinese city, somewhere between Beijing and Shanghai. These kids, I went to the orphanage twice with Linda. They are left in hospitals, sometimes they're left outside police stations, sometimes they're left at the gates of the orphanage. And the kids have, 98% of them have a disability, and some of the disabilities are very severe. But because of the one-child policy, even though it's changed now to a two-child policy, if parents, particularly when they're not particularly wealthy, give birth to a child who has a deformity or a disability, they often will give the child up to an orphanage. And we don't know why. It could be because they don't have the means to care for this child. There's also a superstitious element in it. So sometimes, you know, for example, if a child has a big birthmark or a mark on it, it's seen as, oh, goodness, you know, this could bring us bad luck. And luck in China and symbolism is kind of everything.
They're heartbreaking figures. I can imagine that there just must be really very little prospect of any decent life for these abandoned children.
Well, once they're in an orphanage, fortunately now most orphanages have some affiliation with an NGO. So Linda is the NGO for this particular orphanage. It's amazing now that the US has a whole program to adopt disabled orphans. And actually one of the kids who came to meet me with Linda at the airport the very first time I went to China, I call him Oliver because he had this very sort of sweet face and he kind of just had me at hello, so to speak. He had been abandoned. We're seeing pictures of him now. When he arrived, he had terrible chicken pox, and this is him just before he left. He's a very, very bright kid. He was thought to have spina bifida. Incredibly, an American family saw his face on a video. There he is. And now I think we're going to see him with his American family. Beautiful. He was adopted at 12, which is very old. He's the oldest of 4 little boys. The other child you can see to his right was also from the orphanage, Philip. And now Oliver, or Wenshuan, which is his real name, is the oldest of 4 boys.
That's a marvellous story. Do we have a similar policy and approach here in Australia?
We don't. It's very, very difficult to adopt from China. I think healthy children, you can adopt them, but it takes, I'm not kidding, 7 years. We don't have a very progressive policy for overseas adoption.
And we know that there are people here who would adopt.
Absolutely. I get really heartbroken every time I go to that orphanage and I talk to people about it, because I'm not kidding, some of the children have been abandoned because they're missing a toe or a hand. And you can imagine what a great life that kid would have anywhere, even in China. And yet for some reason their parents have abandoned them.
What do Chinese authorities say about this state of affairs?
Well, you know, it's illegal to abandon a child in China, and yet it goes on. And I mean, you hear big cases. For example, I think there was a case in Shanghai a few years ago when some parents actually tried to sell their children and they bought iPhones and things like that. It was all over social media. They were fined and I think imprisoned. But by and large, these cases just go under the carpet. You know, the kid is left. They have no idea who the parents are and they're taken in by the orphanage. I feel sorry for the welfare authorities. You know, they're having to shoulder this huge burden. It's a pity, though, that there isn't some kind of larger educational element, you know, that comes from the government.
So what sort of difference has Linda Shum and what she's done in her orphanage made to the lives of those children?
It is incredible because she saw that the kids were not being sent out to schools. Most of them couldn't physically move out of the orphanage to go to schools. So she's built a special school inside the orphanage which now has more than 100 kids there. Some kids even from the local community come there because it's hard to find a special school. And it's wonderful seeing these kids, even the very, very disabled kids, get a kind of daycare once a day. So it's really quite uplifting. And the Australian Embassy in Beijing contributes to that too. So it's a nice Australian-China venture.
Jane, this book is sort of seeded with those stories you mentioned before, similar to Oliver, where people from overseas see these images, see these children and just say, that's it, I want to adopt. How did you manage to leave this situation and not think, I want to do the same?
I know, it's really hard. I don't know that I've got the stomach for it, but apparently this is how everybody starts. They say, I couldn't possibly do that. And yet they do in the end. So who knows? I'll never say never.
Well, same. Jane, it's a beautiful book and it's a really important story. Congratulations and nice to see you.
Thanks so much, Virginia.
Thanks. It's China Baby Love and written by one of our own, by Jane Hutcheon.